History usually teaches us one simple lesson: power belongs to the loudest voice in the room, the highest rank on the uniform, or the man holding the biggest weapon. Across decades and continents, leadership has often been defined by force: who can intimidate, who can threaten, who can make others obey. But every once in a generation, history pauses, and something very different happens. Picture a room filled with heat, tension, and expectation. Soldiers stand alert. Journalists hold their breath. Powerful men wait for chaos, because chaos is what they understand. Somewhere in that room, a gun is ready. Money has already changed hands. Loyalty has already been tested. And yet, nothing happens. No shouting. No orders barked. No fists slammed on tables. Only silence. This is the kind of silence that makes corrupt men uncomfortable, because it cannot be bought, rushed, or controlled. At the center of that silence stands a young military officer, calm in a moment where panic would be justified. He does not look like the kind of leader history usually celebrates. No lavish uniform. No palace. No distance from the people around him. Just a man in standard combat gear, surrounded by soldiers who know him not as a ruler, but as one of their own. This story is not about bravery in battle. It is not about who pulled the trigger faster, and it is certainly not about political theater. It is about something far more dangerous to corrupt systems: moral authority. The moment you are about to witness did not go viral because of violence. It spread across phones and borders because it revealed a truth many had been told no longer existed: that leadership can still be rooted in sacrifice, restraint, and service. When a gun was pointed, one man walked forward instead of hiding. When blackmail was offered, he demanded transparency. When betrayal was exposed, he chose mercy over revenge. The world expected blood. What it witnessed instead was control without cruelty, power without fear, and leadership without ego. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré, not as a symbol, not as propaganda, but as a case study in how true authority is built when everything else fails. Because when noise collapses, when money loses its voice, when guns stop working, only character remains. And that is where this story truly begins. To understand why this confrontation mattered, we must first understand the world that produced it. For decades, power in many post-colonial states did not flow from the people upward. It flowed downward, from foreign interests, elite military networks, and closed political circles that operated far above ordinary citizens. Rank was not earned through service. It was accumulated through loyalty to the right patrons. Wealth did not come from productivity, but from access. In such systems, generals became gatekeepers. Not protectors of the nation, but managers of influence. Their authority was reinforced by three things: foreign backing, control over resources, and fear within the ranks. Soldiers obeyed not because they believed, but because resistance was punished. This environment created a specific type of power: institutional power. Institutional power relies on titles, uniforms, money, and external validation. It survives through distance. The further leaders are from the people, the safer they believe they are. Decisions are made in air-conditioned rooms, while consequences are paid for elsewhere, often in villages that never appear on official reports. But alongside this system, something else was quietly forming. A second type of power. Moral power does not announce itself. It is not granted by rank or negotiated through alliances. It grows slowly, through shared hardship and visible sacrifice. It emerges when leaders eat the same food as their soldiers, sleep in the same conditions, and accept the same risks. This is the kind of power that cannot be transferred, inherited, or purchased. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to prominence, he did not enter a vacuum. He entered a battlefield shaped by decades of mistrust, broken promises, and external manipulation. The meeting that later turned confrontational was not meant to be a discussion. It was meant to be a test. Unity summits in such environments often serve a hidden purpose. Before coups come bullets, come words. Before force, comes humiliation. Undermining a leader publicly is the first step in stripping legitimacy. If the target reacts with anger, the narrative is set, unstable, emotional, unfit to lead. If he retreats, the conclusion is the same, weak. This is why the confrontation was inevitable. The old system could not tolerate a leader whose authority did not depend on it. A man who could not be bribed could not be controlled. A man who did not fear exposure rendered blackmail useless. And a man whose soldiers followed him out of respect, not pay, disrupted the most reliable coup strategy of all. The clash, therefore, was not personal. It was structural. It was a collision between two models of leadership. One built on fear and transactions. The other built on trust and restraint. Only one of them could survive in the open. And the room where they met would soon make that choice unmistakably clear. Humiliation is never accidental in politics. It is a tool, precise, calculated, and designed to trigger a predictable response. When an opponent attacks a leader's rank, age, or legitimacy in public, the goal is not insult for its own sake. The goal is reaction. Anger creates mistakes. Emotion creates justification. And once a leader reacts violently or emotionally, the aggressor no longer looks like a traitor. He looks like a necessary correction. This is why public humiliation is often the opening move before a coup. The strategy follows a familiar pattern. First, diminish the title. A captain is reminded that he is not a general. Then, diminish competence. Economic failure, security weakness, inexperience, all stated loudly, confidently, and on camera. Finally, diminish identity. You are just a boy. You are pretending. You do not belong here. Each line is designed to corner the target into proving strength through force. Most leaders fail this test. Some respond with rage, slamming tables, raising voices, ordering arrests. Others retreat, attempting diplomacy in moments that demand clarity. Both responses confirm the narrative, unstable or weak. Either way, legitimacy erodes. What made this moment different was not what was said, but what was not done. As the insults landed, Ibrahim Traoré did nothing. No interruption. No facial reaction. No visible tension. He allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for discomfort to change sides. Silence, in this context, was not passivity. It was dominance. Men who rely on intimidation fear silence because it gives them nowhere to hide. Without reaction, insults lose momentum. Without anger, humiliation loses purpose. The aggressor begins to feel exposed, speaking too much, revealing insecurity, overplaying his hand. This is the psychological trap hidden inside restraint. By refusing to defend himself immediately, Traoré denied his opponent the satisfaction of control. The room began to shift. Soldiers noticed. Journalists recalibrated. The power dynamic subtly inverted, not through force, but through patience. Only after the humiliation had fully exhausted itself did he speak. And when he did, it was not to deny the accusations. It was to redirect them. That decision marked the true turning point. Because once humiliation fails to provoke violence, it backfires. The man who insults begins to look desperate. The man who remains calm begins to look unshakable. Authority quietly migrates from the loudest voice to the most composed presence. In that moment, the strategy designed to break leadership exposed something far more dangerous to the old system, a leader who could not be manipulated into becoming what his enemies needed him to be. And from that point forward, the confrontation was no longer an attack. It was a trial, and the roles were about to reverse. The most powerful shift in any confrontation happens when the accused stops defending himself, and starts asking questions. Up to this point, the insults had followed a familiar script: youth versus experience, rank versus legitimacy, noise versus calm. The expectation was simple. The young leader would either deny the accusations or explode under their weight. Both outcomes would have kept him on the defensive. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He agreed. Yes, the other man had more years, yes, he held a higher rank for longer, yes, he had worn the uniform for decades. And then came the question that changed everything: what did those years produce? This was the moment when accusation quietly transformed into trial. Rather than arguing about his own qualifications, Ibrahim Traoré redirected attention to outcomes. Borders that had collapsed despite decades of command. Soldiers sent into battle without proper equipment. Families left to bury sons whose sacrifices had purchased nothing but silence from their superiors. These were not emotional outbursts. They were moral invoices. Each question forced the room to confront an uncomfortable reality: experience without results is not wisdom. Rank without responsibility is not leadership. And longevity inside a broken system does not equal service. It often equals complicity. The effect was immediate. The man who arrived confident now found himself interrupted by his own record. His posture stiffened. His rehearsed dominance began to crack. The more he tried to reclaim control, the more visible his insecurity became. The audience could sense it: soldiers, officials, journalists alike. The narrative was slipping away from him. This is the danger corrupt authority faces when confronted with moral accounting. It cannot respond without exposing itself. Defensiveness would have required explanations. Explanations would have required truth. And truth was the one thing the old system could not afford to display under bright lights. By reframing the exchange as an evaluation of stewardship rather than status, the power dynamic inverted completely. The younger leader no longer appeared reckless. He appeared precise. Measured. Focused on consequences rather than appearances. The room began to understand that this was not about personal rivalry. It was about accountability, something that had been missing for far too long. Even silence took on a new meaning. When interruptions were denied with a single raised finger, it was not aggression. It was authority asserting boundaries. Not the authority of fear, but of legitimacy earned through consistency. From that moment on, the confrontation stopped being about who deserved the chair at the table. It became about who had earned the right to speak for the people affected by every decision made in that room. And once that question was asked openly, there was no returning to the old hierarchy. The trial had begun. The verdict, though not yet spoken, was already forming. Blackmail only works when there is something to protect. In politics, secrets are currency. Documents, recordings, financial trails, these are the invisible weapons used when public humiliation and intimidation fail. When words no longer dominate the room, threats are quietly placed on the table. That black leather briefcase was never just a container. It was a message. Inside it, the general claimed, were documents capable of ending a presidency in minutes. The implication was clear: exposure, scandal, isolation, collapse. This was the final lever of control, the moment when most leaders panic. And panic is exactly what blackmail depends on. Most men in that position would have demanded a private recess. They would have cut the cameras, called in legal advisors, or ordered the object removed. Secrecy would have been defended with urgency, because secrecy implies vulnerability. But Ibrahim Traoré did the one thing the threat was not designed to survive. He invited it into the light. Open it. Those two words dismantled the entire strategy. By demanding that the documents be revealed immediately, in public, he stripped blackmail of its leverage. If the truth exists, expose it. If it does not, the bluff collapses. There is no middle ground where fear can operate. This response revealed something fundamental. Blackmail is not about information, it is about timing. Power lies in controlling when and how the truth emerges. By removing that control, the threat lost its value instantly. The briefcase, once heavy with menace, became an awkward prop. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists leaned forward. Soldiers watched closely. The man who claimed power through secrets suddenly hesitated. And hesitation is fatal in a confrontation built on intimidation. What made this moment even more decisive was the philosophy behind it. A leader who seeks wealth must hide accounts. A leader who seeks influence must hide alliances. A leader who seeks personal security must hide compromises. But a leader who seeks nothing for himself cannot be threatened. By openly stating that his finances were modest and his priorities public, Traoré reframed the entire encounter. He did not claim perfection. He claimed transparency. And transparency is corrosive to systems built on shadows. This was not bravado. It was strategic exposure. The general could not open the briefcase without risking self-incrimination or humiliation. He could not keep it closed without revealing that his power depended on illusion. Either outcome favored the man who had nothing to conceal. In that instant, fear changed sides. The blackmail that was meant to end a movement instead confirmed its strength. The threat designed to silence authority instead amplified it. And the room learned a lesson that resonates far beyond one confrontation. You cannot control a man who refuses to live behind locked doors. Once that truth was exposed, the remaining weapons of the old system, money, threats, secrets, began to lose their grip. And what came next would prove that some things, once revealed, can never be reclaimed. When intimidation fails and blackmail collapses, corrupt power turns to its most reliable tool, money. For decades, buying loyalty has been the quiet engine behind countless political takeovers. Soldiers are underpaid. Families are vulnerable. Futures feel uncertain. In that environment, cash becomes more persuasive than ideology. Coups rarely begin with gunfire. They begin with envelopes. That is why the signal was given. A subtle nod. A practiced glance. A silent command meant to activate a transaction already agreed upon. In most rooms like this, history would have ended there. Guards would shift positions. Weapons would change direction. The leader would be removed, not by enemies, but by men he trusted to protect him. This was the final calculation. If authority could not be destroyed publicly, it would be dismantled from behind. But something had changed. The soldiers standing guard were not motivated by fear of punishment or promise of reward. They were motivated by belonging. By shared hardship. By a leader who ate where they ate, slept where they slept, and carried the same risks without insulation. This is the critical misunderstanding of transactional power. It assumes all loyalty has a price. When the offer was exposed, higher pay, instant reward, an escape from uncertainty, the room braced for betrayal. Cameras stayed fixed. Breath was held. Even seasoned observers expected the familiar ending. Instead, the refusal was delivered calmly, without theatrics. The words mattered not because they were dramatic, but because they were final. Dignity was placed above money. Service above survival instinct. Orders above offers. In that moment, the meaning of power collapsed inward on itself. Rank no longer commanded obedience, wealth no longer purchased allegiance, fear no longer dictated behavior. The general was left standing alone, arm extended toward men who no longer recognized his authority. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not a spontaneous miracle. It was the delayed result of consistent leadership. Loyalty, unlike obedience, cannot be demanded in a crisis. It must be cultivated long before one arrives. This was the point of no return. Once soldiers publicly reject money in favor of principle, the old system loses its foundation. Because systems built on corruption depend on silence and secrecy. When rejection is spoken aloud, it becomes contagious. Others begin to realize they are not alone. That resistance is possible. The humiliation now belonged entirely to the man who believed currency outweighed conscience. His final advantage was gone. No threats left. No leverage remaining. No illusion of control. What remained was desperation. And desperation, when combined with wounded pride, often leads to the most dangerous decision of all. The confrontation had stripped away every external weapon. What followed would test something far deeper than loyalty. It would test the nature of fear itself. When power loses money, rank, and loyalty, it reaches for its final refuge, fear. This is the stage where words no longer matter. Where arguments collapse. Where control is reduced to a single, irreversible action. A trigger pull. A moment that cannot be undone. The gun appeared not as a strategy, but as surrender. A man who believes in his legitimacy does not need a weapon in a meeting. A man who trusts his authority does not threaten in front of cameras. The pistol was not a show of strength, it was a confession of defeat. The room froze. This is the point where every instinct screams the same command: hide. Duck. Let security do its job. Survival demands distance. Protocol demands retreat. And for a brief second, everyone expected it. But Ibrahim Traoré raised his hand, not to shield himself, but to stop his guards. That single gesture carried more authority than any weapon in the room. Against training. Against logic. Against fear itself. Then he stepped forward. Not suddenly, not defiantly, but deliberately. Each step toward the gun dismantled the threat more effectively than force ever could. Because fear only works when distance exists. When targets feel unreachable. When power flows one way. By walking forward unarmed, he reversed that flow. The man holding the gun began to shake, not from rage, but from uncertainty. Violence requires conviction. And conviction cannot survive when the victim refuses to play the role assigned to him. Calling the general by his first name stripped away the last armor, titles, uniforms, hierarchies. What remained was not a commander, but a frightened individual standing at the edge of irreversible consequences. The words that followed were not dramatic. They were devastatingly calm. You can kill a man, you cannot kill what he represents once people believe in it. This is the paradox of martyrdom that violent systems always misunderstand. Killing an idea's messenger does not erase the idea. It multiplies it. Each bullet becomes an admission that persuasion failed. By naming this truth aloud, Traoré removed the final illusion of control. The gun was no longer a solution. It was a trap. One that would imprison its holder forever. Fear, once exposed, changes direction. The man with the gun realized that pulling the trigger would not restore power. It would destroy what little remained. His wealth would not protect him. His connections would vanish. History would remember only the weakness. And so the weapon grew heavier. The silence returned, but this time, it belonged to the man who had arrived armed. Walking toward the gun was not an act of recklessness. It was a calculated rejectio.